Get ready to remove the filter from your timeline. Get ready to break the censorship of social media. Get ready to support the grassroots alternative to establishment propaganda. Get ready for an authentic voice. Get ready to resist cancel culture. Get ready for free speech media. This is FSM.
From the heart of trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist.
As the left becomes less religious, they become more statist. And as the right becomes more religious, they still become more statist.
Whenever you add government, you by default remove community.
But it actually starts with Bush, right? Like in 2006.
That'd be the most satisfying, like, chair shot, ka-chunk.
And I have no intention of keeping any promise that I make.
The radical messaging is almost more pragmatic sometimes.
It's bad that the state is as big as it is.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching The Naturalist Capitalist. I am, of course, your host, Reed Coverdale. And today, on the other end of the show, we got an exciting guest. I'm sure many of you know him. He's the editor at Rare News. He's the co-author of the book Tea Party Goes to Washington. Jack Hunter. How you doing, Jack?
I'm doing fantastic. Was excited to be here today. Glad to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm starting to forget when I first heard about all these libertarian people out there, because there's like a million of us. But I think I first heard of you back in the Rand Paul days when he was running for president. That's when I started kind of entering the libertarian world, but I didn't really start following you closely until I got a Twitter account a little over a year ago. And that's when I've really been following you closely. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your origin story politically, like where you came from? Were you always a libertarian, or were you more right-wing? I know you did radio in the 90s, the Southern Avenger thing. What was that? And how did you find libertarianism? Was it a person, or was it a group you got involved in? What ended up bringing you there?
Sure, it was certainly an unusual journey, and I appreciate you paying attention to me on Twitter at some point, all the stupid stuff I have to say on a daily basis. I was in actually FM rock radio. One of my closest friends in town was the most popular DJ back when that mattered. This was long before podcasts and streaming. This is when even before people were arguing about Napster with Lars Ulrich, for those old enough to remember those times. But radio was still a force. We had one of the most popular FM radio stations in my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. We were the first station in the Southeast to play Pearl Jam, if that puts a timestamp on it. But anyways, I was politically minded. I was just sort of your basic red meat conservative, what today we would probably call a paleo conservative. And my crazy, wacky friend, who I'm a musician, he was a musician. He's like, why don't you do some political rants on my afternoon show? I'm like, you think like that would work? He's like, yeah, we do crazy stuff. Why don't you come do this? We did it. It immediately took off. And for years, you were hearing 3 commentaries a day by me at the time. And, I have different feelings about this. At the time, I was wearing a wrestling luchador mask, which is, I talked about pro wrestling as much then as I do now, but it had a Confederate flag. And my moniker was the Southern Avenger. And like a lot of people in the late 90s, early aughts, I thought that, I'm for decentralization. I'm a Jeffersonian, and, that's what that was about, and we should secede. And I still believe in decentralization, and Jefferson's one of my favorite founders, who was also a flawed man. But I came later to the realization, around the time of Ron Paul in 2008, I wrote about this Politico in 2013, that you can't use that kind of imagery. It's really being insensitive to the experience of Black Americans, who look at that very differently. And I was so young and bullheaded at that time, you didn't want to think about those things. You can't use those to push the sort of the liberty messages that we all believe in today. And there are still a subset of libertarians who attempt to do that. But I'm sorry, I think that's a grand mistake, and it's insensitive at the least. But anyways, getting back to my origins, I did that. I turned it into a more serious career in talk radio, just basic AM conservative talk radio. Had lost the mask, the whole shtick, the gimmick. I wasn't judging mud wrestling and wet t-shirt contests as I was when I was at the FM station. But it was conservative talk radio. And around 2007, 2008, when Ron Paul ran, he was an anti-war Republican. I was an anti-war guy who, when I was 18 and 19, loved Pat Buchanan. If you were an anti-war person on the right, there was one guy, and it was him. And I was like, how can we get back to that? This was during Bush Cheney. I quit calling myself a conservative. Yeah, you and me and Dick Cheney, we're all conservatives. I'm like, nope, not a conservative right now. So I stopped doing that. Ron Paul came along. I wasn't a libertarian. I had, not really strong feelings either way about libertarians. I knew that sometimes they were perceived as weird, and sometimes I shared that perception, but I knew that we were brethren in our, small government, individual liberty beliefs. So Ron Paul, when he ran, as many people will remember, he ended up getting 1 million votes in that primary in 2008, and we'll get 2 million in 2012. Thousands of people, especially young people, were flocking to the only anti-war Republican in the race. That's what attracted me to Ron Paul. I hadn't read Human Action. It wasn't Rothbard. It wasn't a particular author. I'm like, I'm anti-war. I'm on the right. These people like that guy, we're still in Bush Cheney. Holy hell, what's going on? And then as I began to get immersed in the movement, I became more libertarian. That year, I think, I was in a medium-sized market in Charleston. I was making YouTubes of my commentaries. And 80% of them at that time was defending Ron Paul against Rudy Giuliani and John McCain and the neocons and just everybody. Rush Limbaugh, they were all attacking this guy. So I think it was me, Charles Goyette out in Arizona, who was a radio host, who got fired for his anti-war views, and Andrew Napolitano were the only voices out there on the right saying Ron Paul's the true conservative in this race. He's the guy. So me having a small platform in a medium-sized market, but using YouTube, I was elevated nationally in a way that if the Ron Paul movement had not happened and there were more of people who liked him, who had a voice, maybe I wouldn't be talking to you here today, but that movement became my life. I worked for Ron Paul's campaign in 2012. Of course, I did the book with his eventually senator son, Rand Paul, in 2010. But if that gives you an inkling of how I got to where I am today, I am a right-leaning libertarian today. I accept conservative or libertarian with more emphasis on the libertarian part. And that's where I am today. And that's the sort of the place, my week. I don't know if that was too much information.
No, that was great. I think it really exemplifies how the only way you become attracted toward an ideology is some crossover that you already have. So the anti-war thing was something that struck a chord with you already. What was the next thing that kind of pushed you from being more of a conservative to being more of a libertarian? What part of Ron Paul's message really started grinding at your brain?
That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it because I think this is important. While foreign policy was always the center of my universe ideologically, and still is, I just think that's so important. It's something most Americans don't vote on it because it doesn't touch them unless they're in a military family. But the next shoe to drop for me is, being a red meat conservative on talk radio, it's still like this, and we could argue that it's worse than ever during Trump and post-Trump. And I'm never Trump or pro-Trump. I'm in the middle of all that. He does not affect me emotionally. I think I'm the only person in the country that might be able to say that. But the next thing is, so much of it is the culture war. Whatever it is, in 2004 it was gay marriage with Bush, and it's something else later on. Immigration's a big part of it now. The people who flocked to Ron Paul were rejecting their parents' and grandparents' obsession with the culture war. I remember, I told the co-host on the radio show, I go, my 2 litmus tests for 2008 for president is somebody who's against war and somebody who wants to secure the borders. And I'm not an open borders libertarian. I respect that view, but I believe in national security. Ron Paul, in one of the early debates, said, if we had a true free market, we would not need to demonize these immigrants. He humanized them instantly. And I'm all about that. I was pro-life, so I'm like, we do talk about these flesh and blood human beings like they're animals or something, they're criminals. Well, if I jaywalk, I'm a criminal, but I'm still a human being. Like, come on. If I was a poor person living in Mexico that had to do right for my family, I'd cross that border. I don't care if it's a law or not. You got to feed your family, right? But I began to think more in those terms, and that these culture war things were so temporary and they weren't substantive. They were stupid. They held people's attraction. I mean, I was as guilty as anybody doing this in radio. It's just sort of the where you're working and what you do and what people care about. It didn't matter. It really was us versus the government. It was us versus the state and the people who tell us what to do and dictate. It was about economics and the Federal Reserve, which wasn't even an issue for me before. And I'm not a big economics guy, but I know what Austrian economics is thanks to Ron Paul. I know the problems with the Federal Reserve thanks to Ron Paul and inflation and how they steal from us. I learned that they were new things to me. And those things were so much more important than, well, Obama bowed when he was in a foreign country today. Let's talk about that for 3 hours. Just the stupid crap that is the main fodder for talk radio. So I was changing on talk radio. They always hated me because I was anti-war, but now I was like, why are we talking about, this Obama bowed to somebody? Like, this is stupid. Let's talk about. So I was changing before the listeners' eyes. It became more of a thing on YouTube than that, and I went on to do other things. But it was the culture wars and rejecting culture wars, and I still feel that way. Look, I'm not above using the culture war for libertarian ends. That's where I'm at now. Like, Trump did things that we libertarians agree with and believe, that I can now say to friends and family members who like him, he did this. This is a good thing, and it's a libertarian thing. I don't even bring that up. Don't you agree? One that comes to mind, I have family members, Trump, great, blah, and I'm not like that, but I understand where they're coming from, can even sympathize with it a little bit as far as, having a political identity. That's what so much of it is. But I could say, our prison and criminal justice system is really messed up. There's a lot of innocent people in jail because of these mandatory minimum laws that damn Joe Biden in the 90s helped pass. That damn Joe Biden. Yeah, he ain't right. That's right. But you know who flipped the script on that? Donald Trump. We had this thing called the First Step Act. Relative of mine, this woman, Alice Johnson, what happened to her? No, tell me about it. Then they see them on TV. I'm like, that's the person I was talking about. This poor woman, this grandmother type who's found the Lord and done all these good works, went to jail for many, many years because of a law that Biden supported and Kamala Harris was all about it one time. And Donald Trump said this woman shouldn't have been in jail for a nonviolent offense because she was in the same apartment or car with her drug dealer boyfriend, who also shouldn't have been in jail, but we'll get to that at another time. But she sure as hell shouldn't have been in jail, and isn't that terrible? Yes, it is. I'm glad Donald Trump did that. Yeah, I do that stuff all day long, and that's culture war related, but it's useful, and I have no problem. It's human nature. When I'm talking about these people, I'm careful. I don't want to sound patronizing. We're talking about human nature here. I'm not like, oh, these people are stupid and I'm above it. Look at me and mess. No, it's not that. They're regular people. They're actually more sane than you or I, who worry about all these things that we have no control over every day in politics and philosophy. But I'm not above using those things. I'm not above using it when, Donald Trump talks about I was on talk radio during the Bush Cheney years, and I know what people who said that phrase like me, how they were treated and what a different place we're in. So there's a lot to work with. And I wrote about this, we mentioned in the tweets about libertarian populism. There's a lot of that stuff that can be used in a way that is very different than like what a Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton considers populism. But it's up to liberty people to use it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on a couple points there. One is that when you're ignoring the bullshit, it just puts you in a completely different world. When people are arguing, because I really viewed the Obama presidency and the Trump presidency very similarly as far as what people were arguing about while terrible things were actually happening. They'd be upset that Obama wore a tan suit or didn't salute someone when he walked into the plane or bowed or whatever. And then with Trump, it's that, some way he stood in a ceremony or he walked in front of the Queen or he, ate pizza with a fork or something. It's just like, oh my God, who cares? But then at the same time, you're right. I feel like a lot of libertarians, and I'm guilty of this, we're too thoughtful, like we only care about logic, we only care about facts, and we forget to inject emotion into the conversation sometimes. And you can inject emotion without abandoning logic or facts. Like, you can use emotion to help drive your fact-backed argument, and that's kind of what you're talking about. I mean, populism, you're right, so many libertarians think it only means nationalism or socialism or some like they almost think it means you're lying to people to make them feel better about themselves, where I watched your episode with Brad and you guys were saying that populism is a sentiment, it's not really an ideology. So you can use populism backed with libertarian logic backed by facts, and that's how you can be meaningful and effective.
The Paul movement, wherever you want to do the start and stop, I would do 2007 or 8, and I wouldn't put a full stop on it because I think there's so much that legacy that we're still having today, but the height of it, obviously, after the 2012 campaign, that was a populist movement. There was no, big organization. I laugh. My old friend Bonnie Christian picked me up to speak at the second Young Americans for Liberty conference. I guess that would have been in 2009, and she took me to this like rundown 7-Eleven with a laundromat next to it. There's this little room upstairs, and I was like, "What's that?" She goes, "That's Ron Paul 2008 campaign headquarters." It was a dump. It was terrible, and everybody that worked there complained about it. I didn't know. First time being in D.C. post Ron Paul exploding. But the point is, that was a populist movement. That was a guy with his truth who, if you were in politics, when he ran, I knew who he was. I'm like, man, if that ever caught fire, that'd be awesome. But there's no way that's going to happen. And boy, was I wrong. When he ran, he was the man who had something to say. He'd always stood his ground. Dr. No voted, and people were attracted to that message. It was a populist movement. I don't like what Bernie Sanders stands for. That was an organic populist movement. It was young people hearing something new and fresh. They didn't like Hillary Clinton and the Democratic establishment. Who would? And they liked Bernie. That was a populist movement. When Jesse Jackson ran in 1988, and it was a big thing for the black community, for black America, but also progressive Democrats at the time, that was a populist movement. Google Jesse Jackson populist, and you'll find a million articles. The Tea Party was a populist movement. The hippies in the 1960s was a populist movement. Howard Dean, before he went in 2004, that groundswell behind him was a populist movement. A lot of libertarians have had their minds turned around so badly by Trump that they only associate populism with him and this nationalism thing. And that is a classic definition in many ways, but it's not. But the easiest way to piss off one of the populists that you or I probably don't like very much is to point out that what they call populism is but one definition. They get mad. I do it all the time because it's fun. But, I say these things, and especially Ron Paul, one in particular, who shall remain nameless. He's still my friend. He's just wrong about a lot of things now. I'm like, Ron Paul was a populist movement. He's like, nobody talked about that as a populist movement. Google Ron Paul populist, Christian Science moderate, Ron Paul, populist for president. And there was a thing at CNN that Ron wrote about populism, and his populism was different than this populism. So don't give me that crap. They want you not to think that, and there are too many libertarians who agree with in principle that are just so turned off from the word populism or actual populism that they don't see these things, and they actually work in favor of the nationalists who would really like those to be separate. You never hear the nationalists bring up the First Step Act. Why? Because they all want to be more right-wing than thou, and that's not right-wing. That's actually being nice to oppressed people. They don't want to do that. They want to be jerks. I about said something else, but that's what they want to do. When we talk about criminal reform and George Floyd and that cop that murdered him he had fentanyl in his system. That cop didn't do anything. You know how they do. But we have the example of Donald Trump saying, I talked to George Floyd's family and it's awful what happened to them. Use that as libertarians, if you see what I'm saying. Because what are these people obsessed with? They either really, 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 really hate Trump or they really, really, really love Trump. So the ones that love him, I'm going to remind them what Trump said about George Floyd, while Tucker Carlson, who's right about a lot of things, is on Fox News saying that same fentanyl BS. You see what I'm saying? But there's just not enough people. Tucker's all bad. And when he's talking about foreign policy, I hate him then too. No, it's amazing he says those things on Fox News. But if he's talking about criminal justice reform, he's awful. Or immigration, he's awful. But we can pick and choose our battles. What you were saying earlier, Reed, about using these things, it is about using partisan emotions to point out principles that we agree with. It's also about picking your battles. If you pick every battle and go to war with your friends and family members, which matters more than people on Twitter, people in real life that matter the most and are going to vote a certain way in the future. If you don't pick your battles with them and they just hate you and you're the annoying person, even the good things you want to do, they're not going to listen to you. I think Senator Rand Paul gets a lot of grief. I wrote a piece at the beginning of the year that was published at Responsible Statecraft. The title they gave it was Rand Paul got it just about right during the Trump years, something similar to that. Mm-hmm. And I just pointed out all the libertarian things he did, which is a lot, including voting against Trump and his agenda more than any other Republican, including people named Mitt Romney or Liz Cheney. And people are like, well, I forgot about that. Man, I forgot about those 6 neocons that he got, that were not picked for Trump's cabinet, Elliot Abrams and all these people. And just all the things he did and people focus on the 2 or 3 things they didn't like, and they say, well, he's not Ron Paul and he sucks. No, he was actually pretty effective. I think one of the best examples of that, and I included it in the piece, you probably recall, Reed, I guess it's been about 3 years now, when Trump was going to bomb Iran and then changed his mind at the last. Do you recall that?
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding, and this isn't a secret, this was in Politico, that all of his advisors, of course, were like, you have to do this. It'll be a disaster if you don't bomb Iran. And the official story was 2 things. He asked what the civilian death count would be, and he thought that was too high a price to pay. He shouldn't have been doing anyways, but in his mind, too high a price to pay, so he pulled back. And the other is that he talked to Tucker Carlson on the phone right before when all this was going on. Now, there were only 2 people in President Trump's ear all those years, with John Bolton around him and all these people who were part of the Washington foreign policy consensus. A senator who would remind him, hey, you remember when you said you don't want another Iraq? That was a mistake. You go to war with Iran, this is going to be 3 times that mistake. He would say that over all these years. And Tucker Carlson, who told him the same thing that Rand had been saying all those years on the phone that night. So there's a guy who used to be a libertarian, it's a big star on Fox News that's still good on foreign policy, using that influence. And has been saying this over and over and over. And they were really the only people in his orbit saying these things. Donald Trump comes across to me who does what the last person he talked to thought was a good idea. How about you? If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah,
maybe I'm all over the place. There's a lot of influence we have in ways we don't think about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've talked, I think both times with Iran, after he airstrikes Soleimani, it looked like that too. I think there was a lot of push to have a big retaliation. And then Tucker Carlson did a broadcast and he talked with Rand Paul, and then he decided, nope, they didn't kill any of our soldiers. They just, they purposefully missed us with their missiles. So we're not going to do anything. So, I mean, yeah, I have criticized Rand Paul when I think he should be better and should be stronger, but you're right that, he could have been what averted us from going to World War III almost, like I have mentioned that. And you're totally right about the goldfish thing with Trump. It was just like, he's just kind of floating and, whatever the last person says to him is the best idea. If the guy who brings him his sandwich says we shouldn't bomb Iran, then he'll be like, this guy brought me his sandwich. He's great. It was the best sandwich ever. This guy's really smart. He thinks we shouldn't bomb Iran. I'm not going to do it. That's kind of what he's like. I
don't need to laugh because it's so serious, but you're not wrong. I mean, people, when I say things, they're like, oh, this guy's a Trump guy. I'm like, no, this guy's pretty scary. He's like, he governs by whim. Maybe there's a little more to it than that, but not much. It doesn't seem that way. So,
yeah, no, totally. When it comes to populism and the important issues, I think where a lot of people get this wrong is they think that we can't bring issues to light that people don't care about, because one of Ron Paul's top 3 issues was end the Fed. And that's something that nobody had heard about before him. That was, nobody knew about that. He made that an important message. So this idea that we can only, capture the emotions of people now with issues that are already on the forefront isn't true. You can really educate people and bring other issues to light that explain why we're in the mess we're in.
Not only can you do it, we have done it. The best example, I used to do these debates with my friend Jeffrey Tucker about, should you just be philosophical and not vote as a libertarian, or should you get dirty with politics? And I think it's pretty clear which side of that divide I was on. But one of the examples I would always use, I guess, post 2013, when this happened, many people probably remembered when Rand Paul did his filibuster on the Senate floor opposing John Brennan's confirmation to CIA. He did that filibuster. Conservatives across the board liked it. Rush Limbaugh had him on his show the next day, and he doesn't have guests. Code Pink, I was working in his office at the time. Code Pink showed up with a big heart. I've got a picture of it somewhere. We love Rand Paul. Screw John Brennan. Thanks for standing up for civil liberties. Because the meat of what Rand was talking about was drone strikes and drone surveillance and civil liberties and mass surveillance, drones in particular. Dave Weigel, I believe he was at Slate at the time. He's a Washington Post reporter, and there's a guy that used to work at Reason, so he's kind of in tune and sympathetic to a lot of these libertarian issues, pointed out that I think it was a Pew Research Center poll taken after Rand Paul was just, he was on all the late night shows, for people that don't remember, just very popular across the board, left and right. This was during the Obama administration. That poll showed that public opinion on mass surveillance and drones swung a full 50% from beforehand, when it wasn't even an issue that people were thinking about. Rand put it on the map. The emotion that he was able to capture in that moment made people think about it. Now, maybe they forgot about it later, and we know that they didn't think about it, or at least not that much before. But part of a movement, part of the purpose of having a movement like we have, is to be ready when these things happen, to capitalize on them. My friends at Young Americans for Liberty, this whole Operation Win at the Door thing, a lot of people think that's boring. The idea behind that is when, at the beginning of the movement, like a seat would open somewhere that somebody that's Liberty could feasibly win, you just find like the local crazy person, they would win and run and get 1%, right? Well, I voted LP in the last 2 elections, but a lot of the action is in the Republican Party. If Liz Cheney's seat is vacant, I want a Liberty Republican there instead of somebody that's pretty close to Liz Cheney, right?
Right.
So if they were a state representative before, maybe they'll be a little ready. Part of our movement is being ready and capitalizing on these moments when we get there. Rand did it that day. He didn't expect for the whole world to be watching and do what he did, but that's what happened. And there are other examples of that. But instead of being scared of being mainstream or scared of reaching a wide audience or scared of being strategic and not coming off as an a-hole to most people, so you can be strategic and have an impact when it counts, that's to me why we do what we do and why this movement counts. Look, even like Jorgensen running the last election or Gary Johnson, especially Gary Johnson, my criticisms, and I voted for him, were where he wasn't effective in a time when everybody hated Hillary and hated Trump. It wasn't hating on the libertarians. I was like, man, there's so much you could do here and you're really screwing it up. Even though I knew he wasn't going to be president for a number of months there, it was a grand opportunity. I do care about that no matter who wins the election. That's always important.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think that's something that interested me about you. We have the same exact voting history from Rand Paul. I was a big Rand Paul guy, and then I voted for Gary Johnson, and then I supported Tulsi Gabbard, and then Joe Jorgensen. And a lot of people's minds were just twisted with confusion when I was supporting Tulsi Gabbard. And like you, I didn't agree with her on everything, but it was like, hey, we've got a Democrat who is mostly anti-war, pro-civil liberties. And even though she's got some big government economic plans, she's also skeptical of the Federal Reserve and cares about our debt. So I don't know, I'm willing to take a swing here, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, on Tulsi Gabbard specifically, because the other ones all kind of make sense, but that one, a lot of people don't seem to understand.
Yeah, people have this weird thing in their brain where if somebody's not right on all things, they can't be right on some things, and you can't align with them on those things. The first place my mind goes to is this is not remotely new. One of Ron Paul's best friends in the House was Dennis Kucinich, who's basically a socialist. I had the privilege of being ran through a send-off dinner at the Capitol for his father when he was leaving, and there's Dennis Kucinich and his beautiful wife, because they were friends. Dennis Kucinich is on the hard left. What was something that Dennis Kucinich would emphasize? Civil liberties and being anti-war. Or there's him and Ron, 2 peas in a pod, right? Mm-hmm. Rand and Ron Wyden in the Senate. Ron Wyden's a pretty progressive Democrat. He's the one that asked, what's his face that pissed off Edward Snowden? If I can't think of his name right now. If the government spied, if NSA spied, and he's like, no, not that I'm aware of. And Snowden got mad and did what he did. Yeah. That was Ron Wyden, James Clapper. That's one of Rand's most current or most often ally in the Senate on these civil liberties issues and mass surveillance all the time. They're friends in real life, too. This was no different to me than that. Glenn Greenwald's one of my favorite journalists, and what does he emphasize? Civil liberties, free speech, freedom of the press, anti-war, anti-empire. Where as a libertarian, those are the things I care about. I have talked to him about economics, and I think his economic views are terrible, but that's not what he does. Right. Look, if we talked to Bill Kristol, who we really don't like, I don't mean to speak for you, but I think that's a safe.
You're correct, though. Yeah.
If we talked to him about economics, we would find a lot of agreement. Now, he might be more of a crony capitalist, but as far as it's like free markets and just a base level, we'd be like, yeah, we're kind of on the same page. That's not his emphasis. That man is in love with war all the time, anytime, for any reason, with us. So you can do this all day long. Tulsi Gabbard's not only great on those issues, she's won conservatives over. She's on Fox News all the time, or was at the time. Hollywood and entertainment matter. Here's a beautiful, relatively young woman in the world of politics that catches people's attention. She's a good speaker. She sounds serious. I found her voice soothing. I could go to sleep to that, like a recording of Tulsi Gabbard. But these things matter. You mentioned earlier that too many times libertarians are too smart. I think a lot of our leaders are too smart for politics. And I say that as a compliment and both as a handicap. I think it's true. I say that about my old boss Rand sometimes. He's good and he has enough politically savvy that he's be able to accomplish what he accomplished, but he's too smart for these people. Same with Thomas Massey, same with Justin Amash, who doesn't have to deal with them anymore. But I just find that time after time. So, like, can libertarians put what we think in Mitt Romney's brain and body and, have that? And there are some out there like that. But Tulsi Gabbard is a good messenger as a veteran, as somebody who you want to watch on your television screen to say war is bad. The Democratic Party is just as bad as the Republicans getting into these wars as a Democrat. I mean, all those things matter. So people are like, no, you can't like them because they're bad on gun control or something. We're not talking about gun control right now. If we were, I would say they were wrong. I just don't understand that. And it's been there's the larger libertarian movement that's been around for 100 years, 50 years, going back to the founding, wherever you want to start, Cato in 1970 or whatever. The liberty movement, the Ron Paul liberty movement, 2007, and we're still in some parts of that now. There's always been the left-right alliance throughout. I remember people were making Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich bumper stickers for president in 2008. Yeah. This is not new at all.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And a lot of Ron Paul fans would do well to remember that because he was the example of how you do that. I mean, I don't know anybody else in political history in my life who was so bipartisan and who was so willing to. I mean, it's that quote, I will work with anyone to do good and I will work with no one to do bad. I mean, that was Ron Paul. He would work with anyone. I mean, if Dick Cheney wanted to legalize, I don't know, make selling meat from farms easier, or something like, okay, sure. I mean, it doesn't matter what the rest of the views are. Are you right on that issue?
Well, let me just real quick while I'm thinking about it, we're talking about the sort of transpartisan, bipartisan. Remember Ron Paul would introduce the audit the Fed bill in the House, and it was just him forever. And then later on, they passed it. It was popular because he made that an issue. We as libertarians, his movement, we used the moment to do that. Do you remember who the co-sponsors were on the Senate version? Jim DeMint, conservative Republican, later leader of the Heritage Foundation, and Bernie Sanders. Those were the two co-sponsors for audit the Fed in the Senate. Not even been a bill in the Senate before, but because of Ron's popularity and that issue. But that's changing things. It didn't pass, but those were the co-sponsors. Bernie backed off later as he got a little bit more establishment, but he did.
Oh, yeah, I do remember because you're right. Bernie introduced it and he watered it down or something, right?
Yeah, DeMint was like, what the hell, man? DeMint was fully on board with what, he said a lot of nice things about Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, and at the time that mattered.
Yeah. Yeah, so you spoke at CPAC in 2011, right? Or was it 2010?
Yeah.
2011.
That's right. I think.
Yeah, so I started checking out the Liberty Movement in like 2014. Rand Paul, when he filibustered John Brennan's nomination, that was actually the first thing that really caught my attention and kind of drew me in. And I started listening to a bunch of people and everything. But I feel like Ron Paul really brought the conversation back to economics because, like you said, it's been all this culture war stuff that people are always arguing about. So it looked like the Republican conservative movement was ready to really make that their number one issue after Ron Paul's second run. And, a lot of people were really hopeful for Rand Paul's campaign. I was a huge supporter. I was super excited about it. But then, Trump happened instead, and it seems like the Republican Party is even further from fiscal conservatism than it was before Ron Paul. I mean, because they've gotten a little bit better on the wars, at least rhetorically, I'll grant that. And then, they're a little bit better rhetorically on the national security state, stuff like that. But then when it comes to economic policy, I mean, they're almost as bad as the Democrats. So I was just wondering what you think about the future of the conservative movement as it pertains to the liberty movement. Do you see them separating? I mean, I've seen you say you're hopeful that they can come back together again. I just want to hear your flushed out thoughts on how that would be possible.
Well, I have many thoughts on that. I think a lot of libertarians read on what happened as wrong. They're like, well, they used to think these things during the Tea Party, which was sort of Ron Paul movement, Tea Party. The greatest legal achievement of the Tea Party was the sequester. where if Congress couldn't find places to cut, it happened automatically, and then they got rid of it. But that was a thing for a while, and it was grassroots heat that did that, right? The read that I think people get on it, they're like, well, all these, and I see this from a lot of my friends who don't even call themselves libertarian anymore because they're so disgusted with Trump, and maybe people like me that embraced some of that and rejected other parts of it. They saw, this is also a generational thing. I'm in my 40s, and I saw people in their 30s and certainly 20s behave more like this because maybe I'd seen a little bit more, not to sound like old boomer, hey kids, but like that is a factor because you've seen trends. They saw a Tea Party movement that they could get with. This is Ron Paul. He was talking about fiscal issues. That's what we care about. Let's lower taxes, Federal Reserve. All that stuff was going on. Spend less money, tax enough already, tea, all that stuff. Those people did believe in those things at that time to the degree that they thought about it. But what they really wanted was, I hate the establishment, whatever that looks like, and I want to get at them. That was Thomas Massey put it best when he's like, I thought all these people were libertarian. Then other people came along and I just figured out they wanted to vote for the craziest son of a bitch in the room. That was his what he said. I'm not the first to repeat that. That's what happened with Trump. It wasn't that if you ask these people, do you believe in small government less minute? Hell yeah, I do. Well, Trump's budget did what he had to do because I like Trump. It's all about, maybe I do overuse it, but this stuff is professional wrestling. It's heels and faces. Most people believe what they believe because people they respect or like or admire also believe it. We would not be having a conversation about socialism seriously in the United States right now if Bernie Sanders wasn't a thing. Not in mass, not at a large scale. We're on the view. Is socialism bad or good? Like then you had other personalities like Ocasio-Cortez, members of the Squad, also talking about it, and people in Hollywood embracing it. But it takes a figure. It has to be embodied in a figure. We wouldn't be talking about libertarianism in as broad a way as we do now in 2021 if Ron Paul hadn't come along in 2008. It's just it needs a figure. I mean, you could get as extreme as Hitler. Nazism might not have happened if not for him, and Lenin and Stalin, Castro and Cuba. But that's just the way it is. And I think not enough people recognize that. So the Tea Party, you had, my governor, well, I guess, yeah, he was still governor for a while, Mark Sanford. People were talking about him running for president because he had a lot of Ron Paul's views. He still has the same views, but everybody hates him because what side he came out on Trump. I always use the example of Justin Amash and Rand and Massey, his friends, right? Where does Justin Amash disagree in principle or policy besides impeachment with Rand or Massey? Name one.
Just the marijuana bill with Massey. It's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. But
okay.
Yeah.
Actually, they're the first person to name one. Okay, but we can generally agree they're 99% on the same page, right? Yeah. Why do people say, man, I admire Justin, Rand and Massey, they're gross, they're terrible, but I really admire Justin, or man, Justin really let me down. What happened to him? I like Rand and Massey. What is the one factor? Has nothing to do with what these men believe. It's how that person feels about Donald Trump. Right. It's wrestling. If you think Trump's Hulk Hogan, you think Rand and Massey are good people to do run-ins for him. If you think Trump's the Iron Sheik, the bad guy, that man, this Justin Amash guy, he got away from that bad guy. That's what it is. And I'm sorry, I'm not saying people don't have concerns about jobs and their children's education. They do, but they will rationalize why the guy or person that they like's ideas are good for that, even if they're not. And we saw that with Trump, where some of his tariffs were hurting people and jobs and those people do, well, things happen. He's still great. You saw that a lot. So the Tea Party movement, people are like, oh man, all these people changed their mind. I thought they were small government. Dedicated it as you were to it. And they never will be, but you can capture these moments where they can be, if that makes sense. And that's the way I look at politics. I told you earlier, I was attracted to Ron Paul, not because I read a book and liked these ideas. I was like, how in the hell is so many 20-year-olds liking this old dude talking about war is bad? Like, that's crazy. Yeah. Like, what's going on here? That's my guy, And then I learned about philosophy after. So I'm even one of those people. So, I mean, that's clear to me, but I don't know. Maybe I'm a crazy person and I'm saying it all wrong, but that's what it looks like to me, if I answered your question adequately.
No, I mean, I get what you're saying, and I've actually pointed to that as a tragedy that it's true, that the people who you actually see their minds changed and the people who actually form a philosophy, then they're stable through the ages. But you are right that the masses don't form philosophies. It is all emotional and it's all It's all kind of sensational. It's whatever, whatever the big mean guy is saying at the time, that's what matters.
Yes,
and
even Congress is like this. So like most members of Congress are just like the voters I'm talking about. They're like, I'm a Republican and I'm a conservative. Well, that can mean very different things at different moments in time. 15 years ago, that you don't really care about the spending either, but boy, do you support this war and torture and waterboarding. That's what it meant. That's kind of in the rear view mirror, especially the war stuff. It's kind of a wash. The neocons and the institutions that want permanent war are still there, but the conversations with regular voters can go in very different directions. These are the same people that thought they were conservative 15 years ago. Members of Congress, just the average, I'm not going to name any names, Democrat or Republican, what that looks like can change, and it only takes a few people to change it. Like Nancy Mace, who's a friend of mine, but she also represents South Carolina's 1st Congressional District. She's a liberty person. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a lot of positions where she doesn't line up. The other day, she tweeted on George Floyd's, the anniversary of him being murdered by that police officer. Things have not gotten better in the last year. They must get better. This is a conservative Republican in a red district tweeting that. I retweeted it. Some of the nationalist jerks, we're virtue signaling, blah. No, well, maybe in some way it is, because I want other Republicans that follow me, especially back home in my district that all love her, to be like, hell yeah, that's an issue we should be talking about. We're for police reform. We're with Nancy. Those things are important. Maybe I got off the beaten track, but members of Congress, so some other Republican be like, well, man, she's popular. People like her. I'm for that too. It's that simple.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, it's true. So what do you voted Libertarian the last couple elections. I kind of gave up on the political system in like 2018. I was like,
that's
I don't
the cleanest thing you could do.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of was like, I don't really want to vote anymore. And then Tulsi Gabbard actually kind of inspired me to get back into it. And like you said, it's emotional. Like you see someone who's speaking out against the wars, who's a young woman or whatever, who's eloquent, and it's like, whoa, I never thought I'd see this.
Yeah.
But she kind of sparked me to get back into it. And then I've become very politically active over the last almost 2 years now. But I'm all in on the Libertarian Party. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the Libertarian Party, if you think it ever could become something viable, or if it's just something that exists as a force to make the Republicans and Democrats better, or what you think about it in general.
I think it has the potential to do all those things. Look, I'm just from a personal level, just personal, I'm glad that it exists as a vote of conscience. There was no way in hell I was going. The closest I've came to voting for a mainstream candidate is probably Trump, because of the issues I've discussed here, because nobody else has given me even that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still too many things that were wrong, especially how he talks about immigrants. That's the big one to me. I don't believe in dehumanizing anybody in any capacity. I think that's the worst thing you can do left or right. He did too much of that. I don't even think he did intentionally. He's just kind of stubborn and bullheaded, but that's where we are. So I couldn't vote for him because of that. But I like that there was a third party. Back in the day, I voted Constitution Party instead of for Bush and stuff like that. And I don't know that would be my first choice now. It would be LP. I think comic Dave Smith is one of the best spokesmen for the viability of the Libertarian Party. He's fairly new on my radar the last year, and I think he's an eloquent spokesman for that. I think right libertarians matter. I think left libertarians matter, and the more we can work together instead of infighting is better. To the degree that anybody in the LP encourages that, and it seems like he does that to a certain degree, you've got my vote, in a productive sense. The nature of movements is to fracture. That's the nature of any movement, to fracture. So I've always been like, well, wouldn't it be more interesting if I intentionally tried to do the opposite? So that's why, people say stuff about, what is this going to accomplish? So the LP and a lot of info, I have very close friends that work within the LP, or some that just did. My friend Jess Mears was intimately involved in the LP for many years, very successful, and still has her heart is with the LP. If they can do what my friend Justin Amash and Dave Smith and maybe you and Brian Nichols and some other people think it can be, I will be the first in line to help in that effort. In the meantime, is it 76 million people that voted for Donald Trump and are still caught up in that? I'm going to concentrate on speaking to those people. And I'm not saying that LP people aren't either. You're saying bring them in. But when we can reach the level, and we kind of did this election, my mom, I was home for a lot of 2020 in Charleston. She goes, a lot of her girlfriends, she's in her late 60s, were like, what's that woman you talked about? I'm like, Jo Jorgensen? She's like, yeah. Well, my friends vote for her because she don't like either one of these people. When it starts to reach that level more, that's when I take it more seriously. I have stuff by people I know in real life, not people on Twitter, not people I think are smart. That's where I get my principles from. That's what excites me. But I gauge it on if I'm at my brother's house or my friend's house or at the bar I've been going to for 20 years and what those people think at any given moment, because that's when you know you've broken through. If we get to a point where they're like, man, I don't like Republicans or Democrats, I think I'm going to vote for Libertarian. A lot of people are saying that. Sign me up. I will help with that effort. I don't think we're anywhere close to that yet. So I do know there's a lot of people that really, really hate Trump or really, really love Trump. That's going to be the case for a number of years. So I want to use those elements for liberty purposes. And most of that action's of the Republican Party right now. I don't like the Republican Party. I think they're just as goofy as ever, but there are Republicans in it that I think have done a lot of good and can continue to do a lot of good.
Yeah, I mean, I've said that I kind of look at both parties as the same, and that's mostly true. But because Trump lost, and because of where it was on the timeline, because of the number of Republicans that have anti-government sentiment now that they didn't have under Bush, that they didn't really have under Obama either. You know, they like, it's not just that they're upset their guy's not in there. They don't trust the media. They don't trust the voting system. They don't trust the CIA. They don't trust anything, which is, it's noteworthy. Like, it's worth,
it's good
attention to that and trying to capture some wins off of it.
There was a poll the other day. So during the Bush era, you know, most progressives hated the war and they hated national intelligence. They hated CIA and FBI, and Republicans loved them because they wanted to waterboard as many Muslims as possible. That's kind of where they were, which is terrible. Right. It flipped. Now it's all the Trump voters who are totally suspicious of the CIA and FBI, and Democrats who embraced them. I think it was like 60 or 70%. And look, the lineup at MSNBC is all national intelligence people and neocons, right? They're mortal enemies 15 years ago. Why? Because of one guy. It's wrestling. So that flipped because of how they feel about this guy. Going back to the LP, and I think our friend Brad Palumbo has said this. He might even put the idea out there before I did. I think if you had a figure, a person, if The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, was the LP candidate in 2024, you're all going to do something. You're going to do something. I'm going to be right there doing with you something because he's The Rock. Hell, you know, you can't pass up that. Politics, schmolitics. But you see what I'm getting at. I'm not saying he would do that. He's kind of always walked the line of where he is politically. But somebody at that level that's beloved, or somebody who's even kind of that level that can get enough attention that it grows. I think that would be key. And look, it's not all about national politics. I mentioned Young Americans for Liberty earlier and what they're doing at the state level, that those people can do that. And if they never leave the state level, look at what they could do there. And I know there's one or two libertarians that they actually elected at that level in different places. You probably know more about that than me, but that's also wonderful. That's the most wonderful. I wish they were all LP people and they were all elected all over the place, but that's the problem, isn't it? So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm kind of hopeful Dave Smith will run, and it's not that I think I can win. I just think that out of everyone that we know of now, at least, who looks like they're considering it, I feel that I feel that he kind of has that intuition that Ron Paul had. You know, Ron Paul used the internet before it was really a force. You know, he's the guy who kind of made the internet a political force back in 2008 by really capturing it. I think Dave Smith can kind of do that with the underground media, you know, because I think this whole idea that the mainstream media is ever going to give us a shot, unless it's just to make us look ridiculous, which is kind of what I think they did with Gary Johnson. I think they let him talk a lot because he just made himself look ridiculous. But I think Dave, you know, he can get on Joe Rogan, he can get on Tim Pool, he can talk with Ben Shapiro, Jimmy Dore, you know, people all over the political spectrum. And most of the people who are already listening to those types, they have at some level rejected the mainstream narrative of what's going on. You know what I'm saying?
I agree with you. I'm impressed with his political talents. He might not like that. I've never met Dave. I'm just observing. You probably know him in a different way. But I've been impressed with him. The Joe Rogan, all the things you mentioned. Just the other day, I was looking for something that Greg Gutfeld on Fox said. I was just looking at his Twitter, and there was a Dave Smith tweet that he had retweeted. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Here's a major guy on Fox retweeting the libertarian guy. That's what you want. You want to break into the mainstream, and there are multiple examples, some of what you just mentioned. I'm like, that's really cool. I forgot what it was even about, but just the fact that he retweeted this figure that sometimes it feels like only we know about, and we like him, and there are other figures But no, it looks like he's breaking through to the mainstream, and that's what you want. So good for him. That's great. Good for us that he's doing that. And I think with these intra-movement squabbles, there are my friends who are left libertarians who think anybody who's a conservative libertarian is just bad. His audience, I'm sorry, if you're libertarian in the United States, the primary audience might be some apolitical people, maybe some left people, but it's people who think small government is better than big government, and most of them are going to be on the right. That's just the way it is. I'm sorry. Most progressives, however much they agree with us on civil liberties and foreign policy and things like that, criminal justice reform, when we start talking about economics, we might as well be wanting to put people back in chains and go back to slavery because we believe in like low taxes. That's how they really feel. That's how collectivist they are. So good luck with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had a success on both sides, but you are right when the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire just put a tweet out the other day. I don't know if you saw it, but it was about child labor and how we shouldn't have child labor laws because then, kids could work and a job is more informative than a high school diploma or something like that. And it definitely wasn't worded very well. I would have worded it very differently, but the sentiment was real. I was like, yeah, I mean, I grew, when I was 16, I had a job, but I couldn't use a circular saw or a drill until I was 18, even though I could drive I could drive a car. I mean, so there are all these really dumb laws that we should be able to get rid of. Like, lemonade stands shouldn't be an offense, things like that. But the wording was bad, but the people weren't objecting to the wording. A lot of them were objecting to the principle, like this is horrifying. This is barbaric. This is, whatever. And I mean, so you're right. Like once they get an inner glimpse of what we really think, that a lot of these laws are really dumb and we don't really need the government telling us how to live. Like once you actually give them a glimpse of how extreme our ideology is, they do tend to just cut and run on that side.
Justin Amash has said for years in many forums that he thinks most Americans, not talking about parties, that if you talk to you and just talk about ideas at a basic level, not, we're not writing a book here, that they're generally libertarian. And I agree with him. So the problem with that tweet is, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, it brings images to mind of, 8-year-olds with charcoal on their face in a factory.
Right.
Could you have instead said, my daughter's 14. I want to teach her a work ethic. I wish she could work a couple hours a day at the restaurant that I own because I want to raise my kids right and teach them about the values of hard work. But the law won't let me. Most people be like, yeah, you should be able to do that.
Exactly.
So it's all about messaging. So whatever lunkhead did that tweet, God bless him. I'm sure they're a nice person, but like, you got to think about these things. It's important. Yeah. I'll give you an example. Somebody I used to work for who I think totally screwed this up, but I understand why. And going back to being too smart for politics, does anybody remember that exchange between Rachel Maddow and Rand Paul right after he won the primary about the 1965 Civil Rights Act?
Mm-hmm.
That sounded to most people like, oh, and that's how she spun it. He's for segregation. No, we know that. We believe in freedom of association. And I'm a libertarian who will say and especially from the South, we needed the 1965 Civil Rights Act, even though it's not Goldwater was against it. That hurt him with black voters, many of which who were Republicans back then, because I lived in a region where a black family could be on the interstate and go 7 or 8 stops and they couldn't eat or go to the bathroom. And what do you do about that? I'm a libertarian because I believe in most situations, the libertarian solution is the best one. I'm not so much an ideologue that I think libertarianism is perfect. It can be perfectly applied to all situations. Look, as libertarians, we argue if you open up authoritarian countries to free markets and Western values, that it makes them more libertarian, right? Vietnam's like that. Cuba, to the degree it's been able to happen, has helped a little bit. It's not working like that in China right now. In fact, they're using capitalism against us. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. My point is, we are generally right. Open up these places, but China's a unique situation. Civil Rights Act of 1965 is a unique situation. What Rand should have said is, well, I believe in freedom of association, but sometimes things are so bad, we had to do something different back then. It's important that we value equality and the dignity of men and, something like that. But he's such a libertarian that most of us would have probably gave like it, right? We'd have been ambushed.
Yeah.
So it's things you got to think about ahead of time. If you're the LP and you're tweeting about child labor, think about how you want to do it. Look, I worked for my father's construction company when I was 15 out in the field. That was illegal as hell. But you know what? I did it when I was 14 at his shop, which is illegal as hell. And I think I was in, 8th grade. I had to work in the summer Tuesday and Thursday for 4 hours. The following summer, it was Tuesday and Thursday for 8 hours. And by the time I was 16, it was a 40-hour week in the summer. When my friends got out of school, I was used to working. And a lot of them were like, man, I got to go to work at this place at the mall for 8 hours. My dad taught me a lesson that was useful as a young adult, but it was illegal to teach me that lesson. We should talk about it that way. People can relate to that conversation.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And I actually put a tweet out right after it that basically did what you're saying. I explained how child labor laws were dumb in my life instead of just a blanket statement that leaves it completely open-ended. I like to say, you know how libertarians always say they're, and I didn't come up with this phrase either, but you know how libertarians say they're socially liberal and fiscally conservative? I always say libertarians are fiscally conservative and socially awkward. You know, that's
well, that's more apropos. I think that's such a dated thing too. I think that's a 90s thing. You know, our friends over at Reason Magazine, one of the things I've always admired about Matt Welch and Nick Gillespie is, you know, they were the definers of libertarianism for many years, with Reason being the flagship journal, right? And I love Reason, and they do such a great job of covering things we care about. The Ron Paul movement was a little different than where they were coming from, but those two guys, you know, they were criticized where necessary, but they generally embraced it. And Nick in particular would be like, you know, he says that to this day, the biggest thing that's happened in recent years is the Ron Paul movement. And that's different than some people, not necessarily reasonably camp, that like, oh, we hate the Ron Paul movement. It's like, well, you're an idiot. They've always embraced it. You know, we're a little different, but we're all libertarians. That's how you do it. That's going back to, hey, let's not work together, even though we might have some differences. But I always think those are inflated too. But you see what I'm saying. But I've always admired that. I admire anybody that does that. Dave Smith does it all the time. I admire that too. He even did a tweet one time. He was arguing with somebody. He's like, hey, I don't care about this. You know, we have our opinions, but I'm more concerned with working with this person than working against them. I don't even remember who it was, but I was like, hell yeah, we need more of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, we got one super chat question for you here. Let's see what it says. Did you watch the Floyd Mayweather versus Jake Paul match, and what are your thoughts?
So I did not, because there was a professional wrestling pay-per-view on, and that takes priority in my life. My understanding from some pro wrestlers I saw on Twitter and other viewers is that match was pretty much a pro wrestling match. A lot of people think it was a work. Have you heard that?
It's way out of my wheelhouse. I don't even pay attention to it.
I saw wrestlers who know what a work. For those who don't know, is in wrestling, you're making it look like a real fight as much as you can, but it's not. But they were picking up on things like, man, they're dragging this out, and you know, they know what they're doing. They talk beforehand. I didn't see it, but I saw a lot of people who know a lot more about it than I saying that. And I love the fact that this guy's famous on YouTube and just like making $1 gazillion picking fights with actual boxers. Like, how rogue and outlaw and cool is that?
Well, thanks for coming on, Jack. That was a great discussion. I do enjoy following you and seeing your takes. We got one more question.
Okay.
Any chance Jack will come back to content creation on YouTube? I miss his commentary on current events.
I am making videos again. So those you were talking about history earlier. I think YouTube was invented in 2005, and I was on the radio, and the morning host said, "Jack, you should put your commentaries on this new thing called YouTube." I said, "What's YouTube?" That's how I knew it was. So Ron Paul happened in 2007. It started running. I got away from doing those videos because I was writing books and working for campaigns and stuff. Within the last month, I started making videos again. So if you try to find Jack Hunter on YouTube, and I'm sure there's more than one, find me. I make videos every Thursday, and then when events happen, I make more than that. It doesn't have to be just every Thursday. But I have a couple subscribers. I'm trying to, I think my old channel had about 250,000. That's long gone. So I got a couple hundred. I'm trying to build it up. And if you seek that out, follow my Twitter, follow my Facebook. I share all of these on there. You can find them there. And I appreciate you asking that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, man. That was, like I was saying, that was a great conversation. I like your stuff. And yeah, I've got your Twitter, and I think I've got Rare News linked in the description, so people can go follow you there. If there's anything else you want to say, or anywhere else people can follow you,
you can find me at Washington Examiner. I'm a regular columnist there. Just follow me on social. Anything I do, you can find there and read. I've enjoyed your work, and I enjoyed being with you here today. I thought it was a great conversation. We'll see what the feedback looks like.
All right. Thank you, Jack.